All right, welcome everyone. Happy New Year. I hope everyone's had a safe and pleasant holiday season. We're glad to have you back for our Brotherhood events. So today, working with One Day University, we're presenting and having a talk with Chuck Freilich about the state of Israeli politics presently, and it promises to be a very interesting discussion. We have several other upcoming Brotherhood events. On February 20th, a reschedule from the 13th. We're having Professor Mehnaz Afridi of Manhattan College. And then in March, we're looking to have Westchester DA Mimi Rocha, and we're excited about that. So as you listen to Professor Freilich's talk today, you can enter your questions through the chat. And at the conclusion of the talk, he will be with us live to take our questions and discuss further. Thank you for joining and enjoy the talk.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today, and my thanks to One Day University for hosting us. I'm going to talk today about the situation in Israel. I'll start with a few words about the domestic situation, but most of our time will be devoted to the national security challenges that Israel faces today. And of course, at the end, we'll open up for Q&A. But let me start with a few words of some good news. The new government has now been in office for 6 months, and what a difference 6 months make. There's a sense of normalcy in Israel, a return to normalcy after a very troubled period. I'll come back to that in a second. Normalcy only takes you so far, of course, but it really is a very, very welcome change and something that I think Israel needed very badly. We have Mr. Bennett and Lapid, you see them here, working together in harmony. We see the various ministers back hard at work, tackling the challenges of their ministerial portfolios. There's a sense of change, maybe of some hope in the air. Now, the new government is really a rather unique combination of 8 different coalition parties, from the far left to the far right, sitting together. For the first time, there is now an Arab party in the coalition, and not just an Arab party, but an Islamist one, an active member of the coalition, working very, very diligently to achieve the needs, to promote the needs of its constituency. For the first time in a long time, since 2012, there is no religious party in the coalition. That has happened in the past as well. There were other cases, but not that many in Israel's history. There's a potential here for a major realignment in Israeli politics. First of all, the idea of the left and right actually working together. Can they do this in the future? The secular and traditional majority on the right and on the left without the religious parties. That opens up the potential for all sorts of new coalitions in the future if this coalition shows that it can work. If the Arab parties now become accepted members of future coalitions, that opens up new coalition arithmetic for the center and center left. Demography was very much against them, and the assumption was that it would be a long time before they would ever be able to form a coalition on their own again. Well, that could change now as well. So we're in a period of considerable political transition. And it comes after a period in which Israel faced, I would say, almost a perfect storm. Think of where we were 6 months ago, a year ago. We were in the midst of the worst legal and political crisis in Israel's history. This was a result of the former premier, Mr. Netanyahu's attempts, all barred attempts, no holds barred, all out attempt to remain in office and remain out of jail at just about all costs. You see him here in the courtroom. Mr. Netanyahu really went pretty far. I understand I wouldn't want to go to jail either, but he went very, very far. It beyond just the acceptable limits of a politician who also wants to stay in office, and that's more than legitimate. What he did shook the very foundations of the rule of law in Israel, of Israeli democracy. I am glad to say that Israeli democracy proved stronger. Now, it's not over. He's still working 24/7 to try and topple the new government. He's a very effective leader and politician. So it's not over. But the good news is that it is increasingly looking like the crisis is behind us. The new coalition will maybe not live out its entire 4 years. No Israeli coalition has ever done that, but maybe a lot of it. And it's certainly beginning to look like the rotation between Mr. Bennett and Mr. Lapid at the 2-year point, in other words, a year and a half from now, that's increasingly looking likely as well. Now, in addition to that, there were very, very severe social tensions at the time. It was increasingly looking like Israel was reaching a point almost of anarchy. The ultra-Orthodox population, the Arab population, were both out of control in a state of semi-rebellion. And in the case of the Arab sector, it indeed broke out in unprecedented violence back in May. Well, it's not as if those problems are completely resolved, obviously not in just 6 months, but the tensions are way, way down. And as I said, the Arab party in the coalition, the Am party, is busy delivering for their constituency and very, very effectively. We were in the midst of the COVID crisis. We're back in the midst of the Omicron crisis. Mr. Netanyahu, who had really dropped the ball on the COVID issue for over a year, possibly intentionally as part of his effort to remain in office. I must say he then rebounded very, very well and gets a great deal of credit for the tremendous vaccination program that he spearheaded. And the new government has also continued to address the issue responsibly, rather ably. I'd give them a B+ on this. And now we are in the midst of the Omicron surge, which is just off the charts in Israel, as in the rest of the world. We were also in a deep economic crisis a year ago and beginning to come out of it half a year ago. Well, for the last half year, the economy has simply been booming, way beyond the already high expectations that were there. And now, of course, we'll see what effects the Omicron crisis has on it. I think tragically, there are many, many similarities between what's been happening in Israel in the last few years and what's been happening in the United States. And I believe that people, certainly critics, should bear that in mind when they also consider Israeli politics. But here, let me turn to the national security issues. And when I talk to an American audience, I like to start by showing, first of all, just showing the map of Israel. Just take a look. You've all seen it umpteen times, but look at it from a national security point of view. Remember, Israel from very top to very bottom is 300 miles long. That's it. And at its widest, here near Beersheba, it's maybe 80 miles. And then I ask people, well, what's the narrowest? And a lot of people jump and say, oh, well, it's 9 miles. And they mean here at Netanya. And actually, it's only 8.7 miles. And a third of a mile is significant when your country at the very heart, just a few minutes north of Tel Aviv, is only 8.7 miles wide. But that's not the narrowest point by far. Up north, the so-called Finger of the Galilee, it's about 5 miles. And down at the very bottom below Eilat, of course, the V comes down to a few hundred yards. And again, when talking to an American audience, I think it's worth always bearing in mind the difference in scale. Again, it's not as if we don't know about it, but just take a look at that. it gives one pause and makes one understand why Israel takes its national security challenges quite as seriously as it does. And I used to say facetiously that Israel is so small you could put it in one of the Great Lakes and it would sink and nobody would ever know. Well, somebody has as warped a sense of humor as I do. And then just take a look at Israel compared to the Middle East. Again, it puts things in a sense of proportion. But here I'm actually a bearer of good tidings, in the sense that I believe that Israel's national security strategy has been a resounding success. First of all, Israel is here today. Its existence was not at all assured in the early decades. As a matter of fact, it was in question. Well, we're here. And Israel has become an established state, a prosperous state, and I would argue a fundamentally secure state. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't still face some really severe national security challenges. We do, and I will talk about them in a moment. But I believe that Israel won its existence, and that's a dramatic achievement for Israel's national security. By the way, it's also a dramatic success of American policy, because the US-Israeli special relationship was explicitly designed to promote Israel's security so that, I quote, Israel could defend itself by itself against any combination of threats. That's a huge success. There are no existential threats today, and I don't believe there will be unless Iran goes nuclear, and we have to prevent that from happening, and I'll talk about that soon. There are no conventional threats of significance anymore. The Syrian and Iraqi armies, the two threats that the IDF was built to address for decades, were decimated by their civil wars and do not present a significant threat to Israel today. For the most part, the threat that the Arab countries present to Israel today is no longer their military strength. It's their internal weakness. It's the fact that most of the Arab world, certainly much of it, is in a state of crisis or will probably soon be in a state of crisis. Much of it has been for a long time. And it externalizes its domestic travails. Ben-Gurion, Israel's founding prime minister, famously said back in the 1950s that if Israel ever had a Jewish population of 5 million, a totally unimaginable figure back in those years, well, then its existence would be assured. Well, we crossed the 7.5 million point. We won our existence. Now, when I say that to audiences in Israel, to Jewish audiences in the US, people very often, they jump and, how can you say that? There are huge threats out there. Yes, there are. We have a hard time as a people accepting good news because we've got a fair amount of history behind us. But I do believe that no one can destroy the state of Israel anymore. A huge success for Israel's national security strategy and for the US-Israeli strategic relationship. The Abraham Accords were also a dramatic change just a year ago. Israel is increasingly becoming an accepted part of the region. A century-long dream is really happening before our eyes. There are now 6 Arab states in a formal state of peace with Israel. There are a whole variety that maintain unofficial ties with Israel. We'll soon be able to say that there are more states at peace, or official or unofficial, than still in a state of hostility with Israel. And really, it's mostly Syria today of the Arab states. Now, there is Iran, not an Arab state, and I will come back to Iran in a moment, a huge threat. And there are Hezbollah and Hamas, non-state actors. But Israel is increasingly becoming an accepted part of the region. There are all sorts of cooperative agreements that have been signed with the UAE, with Bahrain, Morocco. Normalization is going ahead quite nicely. And people even talk about strategic cooperation. first and foremost in terms of Iran. It's a different Middle Eastern world for Israel. I believe that Israel, because of what I've been saying until now, is strong enough today to chart its national course from a position of strength. We are at the height of our national strength. The Arab world is at the depths of its weakness. Israel can make some of the critical decisions that it has to make as a nation from a position of strength, whether it's on the Palestinian issue, whether it's joining the Gulf states and other Arab countries in addressing the Iranian issue, in preventing the processes of delegitimization, which is spread around the world, and making increasing inroads into the US, and more. But there are still major threats, none more than Iran. And here you see some pictures of the Iranian nuclear program, the reactor in Bushehr, former President Rouhani visiting a nuclear facility. I believe that Iran may be the first state that is the first adversary that Israel's had, that is too big, too far away, and too powerful for Israel to be able to defeat it. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't defend ourselves successfully. I think we can. That doesn't mean that we can't take actions to reduce the threat, as Israel is doing against Iranian entrenchment efforts in Syria. But Iran is too big to be defeated. Iran is also a very sophisticated, carefully calculating actor. Now, there are certainly extremists, but they are also very carefully calculating about those extremist positions. And to their credit, back in the 80s, or certainly by the early 90s, they had identified Israel's home front, the civilian population, as its weak point. And if you look at it, pretty much everything that they've done since then has been focused against the home front, whether it's the mammoth rocket arsenals that it built up for Hezbollah, and I'll come back to that in a minute, support for other Shiite militias in the region, support for Hamas. Even the Iranian nuclear program is actually intended primarily for Israel's home front. It's not for war-fighting purposes. And Iran adopted a long-term, decades-long strategy that I call attrition until destruction. The objective is Israel's destruction. They are a fundamentalist regime. Their sense of time is very different from that of democracies, certainly a frenetic democracy like Israel's. And if it takes decades, that's okay, but that's their objective. They've provided Hezbollah with 150,000 rockets. Now, this map is actually out of date because they can cover every inch of Israel today. Most of the rockets are still short range. They can only cover the northern portion of Israel, let's say down to Haifa. But many thousands can reach Tel Aviv and the center region, and some can reach all the way to the southern tip. This is an absolutely mammoth arsenal. And the really severe danger here isn't just the numbers, that's bad enough. Because if and when the next round takes place, the civilian population, the home front in Israel will be hit as it has never been hit in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The real problem is that Iran is now giving Hezbollah precise rockets, ones that you can literally put on a dime. And that is a potential game changer because it means that they can hit the IDF's mobilization processes. And remember, the IDF is mostly a reservist army. They can hit offensive capabilities, shut down air bases, at least for a while. They can try and overwhelm and destroy Israel's defenses, including Iron Dome and other systems. They can hit command and control from the prime minister's office down to the local military command and control centers. They can hit Israel's civil infrastructure, power stations, water facilities, communications nodes for cell phones, for internet service. So this is really a huge threat. As a matter of fact, short of Iran going nuclear, Hezbollah, a non-state, or maybe better said, sub-state actor, is the biggest threat that Israel faces today. And then there's Hamas. They also can cover most of Israeli territory today. And I used to say that they're a limited threat. It's not so limited anymore. Their arsenal still much smaller than Hezbollah's, but still a couple of few tens of thousands of rockets. And the biggest problem with them is that the rounds erupt frequently. With Hezbollah, deterrence has been built over the years. With them, it's much, much harder. The good news, of course, is the Iron Dome system. And here you see the anti-rocket system. And here you see the system itself on top. And on the bottom, just a truly amazing picture. You see the rockets incoming from the right during the last conflict between Israel and Hamas in May 2021. And you see on the left, the interceptor rockets up in the air, and they seem to be going in all sorts of crazy directions, which is the way they home in on the incoming rockets, and they've got maybe 15 seconds for the interception. So the threat is really growing. It's severe. It's all against the civilian rear, most of it. And the nature of warfare has changed in general. For Israel, for the United States, a global superpower that couldn't deal with the insurgency in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's not that the US couldn't have done it. It's not that Israel can't handle these threats. In both cases, the answer is we can. The problem is that the threats, as severe as they may be in Israel's case, the price to be paid for dealing with it effectively, for trying to put an end to it, is very high. And no one wants to do that as long as there's any alternative whatsoever. I think that Israel, like the US, is reaching the limits to the utility of military force. Now, let there be no mistake. Military force is still critical. Israel wouldn't be here for 2 minutes without its military capabilities. But there is no military solution to the Palestinian issue. We've been fighting the Palestinians for over a century. If necessary, we can continue doing it for a long time to come. You can put down terrorism militarily. You cannot defeat nationalism militarily. We can achieve a delay in the Iranian nuclear program if we're forced to take military action. Can't destroy it anymore. They've got the knowledge, they can reconstitute it. There is no effective military solution to the Hezbollah and Hamas threats, at least at a price that Israel wants to pay. So I don't see a military solution to any of the major challenges that Israel faces. That's the bad news. The even worse news is that there may not be diplomatic solutions to any of these issues. Now, in addition to these military threats, there are a variety of other non-military ones and one semi-military one that are also deeply concerning. There's the demographic challenge or threat that I will come back to afterwards. There's the problem of delegitimization around the world, tensions in Israel's ties with the diaspora around the world, and the cyber threat. And here it's, of course, it's mixed because on the one hand, Israel is considered one of the world's top 5 cyber powers, but on the other hand, it's one of the countries subject to the greatest number of cyber attacks of any country in the world. I believe that as an established state whose existence has been assured, there's still the question of what kind of existence we will have, but our existence has been assured. So as an established, fundamentally secure state, it is time for, first of all, just a change in psychology. Israel still feels and very often acts like the small, weak, embattled state that it was of the early decades when we've become a regional power. So first of all, we need a little bit of a change in our national mindset. But then that would lead to a change in Israel's strategy to one of what I call strategic patience. Now, strategic patience would be based on 5 elements. First of all, it would still be based on military power, strong offensive capabilities. As I said before, without those capabilities, Israel wouldn't be here for 2 minutes. We still live in a very, very hostile region. The second element is deterrence, critical. I believe that we are building it with Hezbollah and Hamas, still more with the former. It took 3 decades for Israel to reach a level of deterrence with Egypt until it made peace, and longer until the other Arab countries either made peace or abandoned the objective of destroying Israel. It's even harder to do it with sub-state actors such as Hezbollah and Hamas, but I believe we are in the process of doing so. The third element is defense, and I'm mostly talking here about rocket defense. And Israel already has a significant capability with Iron Dome and David Sling, and the government has made a decision to invest heavily in expanding the defensive systems. There's always the question, where do you put your money? Because you don't win wars by defense, but the decision has been made to put a lot more money into defense today, and laser defensive systems are going to be coming online in the coming years. A fourth area is diplomacy. In the early decades, Israel, because of the nature of its strategic situation, the emphasis was almost entirely on military options. It was about just surviving to the next day. People didn't have a lot of time and patience for diplomacy. It wasn't considered very effective. And it still only takes you part way today also. But I believe that we have to put far greater emphasis on diplomacy than we have. And finally, a policy of greater restraint. As it is, Israel exerts great restraint, I would say admirable restraint. Most countries would not tolerate incoming rocket fire and all sorts of other provocations that Israel has to deal with. But I believe that, again, because we are as strong as we are today, we can show even greater restraint than we have. Now, the number one issue, it is still, I believe, the foremost national security challenge that Israel faces is in terms of the relations with the Palestinians and the need for a solution to the conflict. I remain firmly convinced that a 2-state solution is the only possible solution that provides both of the sides with most, not all, but most of their national aspirations. People talk about a 1-state solution and all sorts of other various fancy ideas. They don't work. They don't work, and they don't provide either side, certainly not both sides, with most of what they want. Well, it's been decades. We haven't reached a 2-state solution yet. That doesn't mean that it's not the right solution and that we don't have to keep working at it. Unfortunately, the current government is stalemated on this issue between the left and the right. It's effective in other areas, but here there's an agreement not to agree and not to go forward. But what we should be doing in these circumstances is trying to preserve the option for a 2-state solution for a future date when both we and especially the Palestinians are willing to go forward. I say especially because they've rejected some really, really dramatic proposals on 3 occasions, going back 20 years ago and 15 years ago, that would have provided them with a Palestinian state on 100% of Gaza, almost 100% of the West Bank, a capital in Jerusalem, control of the Muslim holy places, and they turned that down. Well, we have to keep that option alive for the future. Now, by the way, I have no illusions about what a Palestinian state will look like. In all likelihood, I hope I'm not being overly pessimistic here, but from everything that I know about this region, in all likelihood, it will end up being another corrupt, authoritarian Arab state, probably irredentist, In other words, the conflict will not end completely. So why support a two-state solution if that's the case? Because the alternative of the emerging one-state reality is even worse. Now, on to the Iranian nuclear program. I was and remain a strong supporter of the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal. Not as a great deal, it wasn't. It was badly flawed. I believe the US got out-negotiated in 2015. I think it's in the process of possibly getting out-negotiated once again. But simply because it was and remains, to my way of thinking, the best of the bad options. Sabotage, Israel's apparently been pretty successful in that, buy some time. Sanctions put pressure on Iran. It got it to compromise, not to give up the program, and unlikely that there's any level of sanctions that will succeed in getting them to do that. The military option is there, but it's the absolute last resort. Diplomacy is far preferable. I do believe that if and when we've exhausted all other options, we're not there yet. If and when that day does come, I believe that Israel has no choice but to take military action. The price to be paid will be severe, militarily, diplomatically, with the international community, with the United States. The alternative of allowing Iran to go nuclear is simply intolerable. We can't allow it to happen. In the meantime, what we should be doing is having a comprehensive strategy with elements of all of the different areas. Ongoing sabotage, ongoing sanctions as heavy as possible, diplomatic and economic, maybe quiet attempts to cause domestic unrest in Iran, developing a credible military option. I don't believe that either the US or Israel has a credible option at the moment. Maybe they have it in reality, but it doesn't appear to be credible to the Iranians or pretty much anyone else. And of course, diplomacy. And if we depoliticize this issue, in the US, it has become deeply, deeply political. If you're for the JCPOA, you're a Democrat. If you're against it, you're a Republican. That's not the way this should be handled. These have to be bipartisan, non-politicized issues. We should all be against a nuclear Iran. We should all greatly prefer diplomacy. We should also prepare for the possibility that other options may prove necessary down the line. And that brings me to the second to last issue that I will address, and that's Israel's relations with the US. Now, if there's one issue that really keeps me up at night, it's that as if the others aren't problematic. But I'm really worried about what's happening in the relationship with the United States. Somehow I think we'll work things out with Iran. One way or the other, we'll work things out in the end with the Palestinians screaming and shouting in the worst possible way possible. We'll handle Hezbollah and Hamas. The one issue which in the end really is existential is the relationship with the US, because it's the basis for everything else. In my last book on Israel's national security strategy, I posed a question there: can Israel even survive today without the United States? Now, that's a really tough question. It took us 2,000 years to renew our national sovereignty. 73 years later to be asking, can we even survive without the US? I don't know the answer, by the way. Maybe in dire circumstances, people come up with dire solutions. It's certainly an existence which is much, much weaker from a military perspective. It means going back decades in Israel's defense position. It means a much poorer existence. This is an existence that no one in Israel, left to right, wants to go back to. So what should we be doing about it? And there are some really disturbing trends in the US today. In the last few years, we've seen not a fluctuation, not a decrease in support for Israel on the democratic left, but a collapse in support. We saw 3 presidential candidates raise the possibility of making American military aid to Israel contingent on a change in its policies towards the Palestinians. If there was one thing that was sacrosanct in the US-Israeli relationship, it was military aid. By the way, I think it should remain sacrosanct because Israel still faces, as I've said till now, some really, really daunting and even dire military threats. So that should be kept out of the bilateral dialogue. But there's a change. There really is a change, especially among young people. Most of the American Jewish community, something like 70%, is Democratic and leans towards the more liberal part. And so we've seen a decrease in support from the Jewish community, more and more people distancing themselves. And there are demographic changes in the US that will impact the relationship. First of all, the Jewish community is intermarrying itself out of existence. Now, I have nothing wrong with intermarriage per se, but if you want to maintain a Jewish identity, we know that the two don't go together very well. And there are demographic changes that have nothing to do with Israel, but will have a major impact over the years on the relationship. There are population groups within the US, such as the religiously unaffiliated, that are growing very rapidly. The Hispanic population. The Hispanics aren't anti-Israel, they just don't have much of a relationship with Israel. And we know that there's a direct correlation between religiosity and support for Israel. So I think we're living on borrowed time in terms of the relationship. We're very fortunate to have had a pro-Israel president, Mr. Trump, now Mr. Biden. I think Biden, just from an age perspective, is likely to be the last of the presidents who really gets it from his kishkes, from the inside. That's not to say that there won't be future pro-Israeli presidents. There may very well be. But when Democratic presidential candidates can raise the kind of issues that happened last time, I don't know what's going to happen 4 and 8 and 12 years from now. The most important thing that Israel could do to ensure the long-term longevity of the relationship would be to reach a deal with the Palestinians, or at least to create the impression, this isn't the impression, I think, in American public opinion today, that it's the Palestinians who are responsible for the impasse. So we don't even have to reach the breakthrough, just create the image. And there are other things that could be done to help improve and ensure the long-term longevity of the relationship. And let me conclude with one last issue, a couple of words about Israel's society. I think if you look at it over the decades, Israeli society has proven itself to be a remarkable asset, a national security asset. People tend to be, especially in Israel, very critical of Israel's society. It's weak, spoiled. Well, this is a population that has gone through 6 real wars and endless, more limited wars, significant conflicts, ongoing terrorism, intifadas, rocket fire. I think it's held up quite well. It's under a lot of pressure today, but it has still held up remarkably well. And the fundamental strength is still there. But I think one of the things that we know today, because we've become an established and prosperous state, and essentially a fundamentally secure one, we know that we now have to start paying more attention to social issues. They've been put off for too long. The national security issues push them out or aside for too long. We have to assure that Israel is a place that young people really want to live in. Israel's high-tech sector is an international marvel. People in that area, and not just the high-tech sector, they're very light on their feet. They can take jobs anywhere in the world, and they do. Israeli academics, especially in the critical areas, the mathematicians, the physicists, computer science specialists. Their numbers in foreign academia are absolutely staggering. Actually, the immigration level from Israel is quite low, much slower than people believe. But within some really critical areas, there is a significant brain drain. We have to change that. We have to deal with the cleavages in our society that did threaten to tear Israeli society apart just a half a year ago. Electoral reform, unfortunately, it's not going to happen for the foreseeable future. But if you ask me what is the most important national security change we could make, that's certainly one of them. And declaring a national war on poverty and social gaps. So I hope I haven't depressed you too much with the problems. They are there, they've always been there. I think actually, I'll go back to what I said in the beginning, Israel's national security strategy has been a resounding success for all of the difficulties. We've gotten through the challenges so far. I believe we will in the future as well. Am Yisrael Chaim. And with that, let me take your questions now, and hopefully I can provide some answers. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. Even if my browser isn't fully cooperating. And where are we?
We're live now. I think the talk part is over. We're up for Q&A.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks. So question was put out earlier about the Iran nuclear pact. Were we better off with it or not? I know you alluded to some concerns about it. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. I think that's one of the most critical issues we face. Look, let me start off by saying, full disclosure, I was a strong supporter of the deal, the JCPOA as it's known. Not because I thought it was a perfect deal. It wasn't. It was a negotiated deal. Negotiated deals, by their very definition, require compromises on both parts. As a matter of fact, both sides made serious concessions. Certainly the US did. And some of those concessions were critical. Start from the fact that the Obama administration had said that they wanted a complete dismantlement of the Iranian nuclear program, the whole program. Well, they were forced to back off from that. All right, if we recognize that that was a necessity, but still, the agreement included years, 10 to 15 years after it came into effect, meaning 5 to 10 years from now, because in this month, the first 5 years are over. The deal didn't include Iran's ballistic missile program, which is a major problem. And to that, you now have to add what wasn't a big problem yet at the time, but today certainly is. It's not just the ballistic missiles, it's cruise missiles and drones as well. And it didn't include Iran's regional expansionism. Now, still, I think it was the best of the bad options because it would have given us 10 to 15 years of essential quiet peace of mind as far as the nuclear program went, not the other issues. But the nuclear issue was the absolutely critical one. That's the only one which presents an existential threat to Israel and maybe an existential threat or a semi-existential threat, in any event, a severe one to other American allies in the region. And of course, it's the center of American non-proliferation policy. And little is more important than that. In the meantime, a lot of time has gone by. So some people say, well, is it still worth doing it if 5 years have passed? And I think the answer is yeah, because the alternative may be that Iran breaks out in the near future. This still puts a cap on things. Now, President Biden, when he was still running for office, spoke of a return to the old deal as a basis for then signing a new and better deal. Frankly, I never thought that that could really work, and it isn't panning out so far in reality. Why would Iran agree to what the US and Israel consider a better deal when by definition it would be worse for them? Why would they agree to that when the United States is the side that withdrew from the agreement, even though there was no one in the CIA thought that Iran was in violation of the deal? They were adhering to it. Now, maybe Mr. Trump was right that it was a bad deal. It never should have been signed, but it was. And normal practice is that you adhere to your signatures. So for the Iranians to go back to a deal that's worse for them, that the US pulled out of, which in effect proved, I mean, it's hard to say this, but it proved the Iranian hardliners right. They said the United States isn't the trustworthy signatory. They can't rely on the US to live up to its word. And Mr. Trump proved them correct. Now, I think that they understand that Mr. Biden represents a different, more responsible kind of president. And they're not really concerned about Biden, but they are concerned about who can be in the White House 3 years or 7 years from now. And time goes by quickly when you're having fun. So how do you get them to agree to a better deal? The answer is you probably can't. And as a matter of fact, it's proving extraordinarily difficult to go back even to the old deal. I still hope that's possible because I think the alternatives are worse from our point of view. Because if we can't get back even to the old deal, well, sanctions were never enough to force the Iranians to change their basic policy. It got them to compromise a little, but that was it. Sabotage operations gain time. They're very important, but that's all they do is gain some limited time. And for those people who talk about regime change in Iran, well, that's great. The only problem is that it's been, 42 years now since the revolution. Nobody has ever known how to do it, and they still don't. So through a process of elimination, the best of the bad options was, and I believe remains, trying to get back to the deal if we can.
Okay, thanks. I can't see another question posted at the moment. I'll give you one of my own. I think discuss a little bit the domestic political situation in the United States, with regard to the American Jewish community's, relationship or position in our domestic politics and how that influences our relation with Israel. I mean, from my perspective, speaking for myself, you see challenges on both the left and the right with the attitude towards Judaism and Israel. Some of the statements you've pointed out about conditioning military aid versus some of the maybe concerns on the right with the heavily nativist views, increases in anti-Semitic incidences throughout, and knowing like historically, just in a general sense, we've understood an Israeli-American relationship to be built upon bipartisanship, Israel looking to, have good relations on both sides of the aisle politically. Where do you see things, sort of heading or happening today?
Well, I'm very concerned, not in the immediate term, in the sense that I think that the new government in Israel really is trying to improve things. And Mr. Biden is a good friend. And, well, the truth is there could actually be significant differences of opinion, even in the short run. If a nuclear deal isn't signed, then there will be differences because Israel will be pushing to take a hard line that the administration will not want to take, including military action. Just going back to sanctions, I do not think will satisfy Israel. So I think there will be differences over that. But I think the problem is more fundamental, which is that we have a few generations of Americans who've grown up knowing post-67 Israel, not the pioneering, heroic Israel of the early decades. Holocaust memory is disappearing as time goes by. And it's harder and harder to sell Israel, so to speak, to especially a young American public. And it's particularly hard to do it on the Democratic left. And I mentioned, the presidential candidates talking about making military aid contingent on Israel's Palestinian policies. And I'm not even disputing the objective, the substance of what they're saying. Certainly there's room to call for change in Israeli policy on those issues. But to link this to military aid is a really frightening move. And the change in the American Jewish public in terms of support for Israel, there's a significant change. Now, most American Jews still identify strongly and are still supportive, but the numbers are decreasing and the support isn't quite as strong as it was. And if Mr. Clinton got 70% of his, Bill Clinton got 70% of his, it was an incredible figure of his campaign funding from the Jewish community. Mr. Dole got 30%. Now, it's not as if the American Jewish community has become any less philanthropic than it was. It hasn't, but it's not giving as a Jewish community anymore. It's giving just as general American citizens. It's unidentified. I think you have organizations like J Street, or not like, but it is J Street, where even if I happen to agree with them on many of the issues, they came out in support of the JCPOA. I supported that. I certainly share much of their criticism of Israel's policies on the West Bank / Palestinian issues. I think it is a fundamental error for this organization ever to have been established and to still be around at this point, because it splinters American support for Israel in Washington. We talk about bipartisanism or bipartisanship. Part of that was also that there was one pro-Israel lobby in Washington, AIPAC, which has done an absolutely remarkable job in building the relationship. And I believe that the place to change Israel's policies, if one believes that they should be changed, I do, the place to do that is here in Israel. It's not in the United States. It's certainly not in Washington. The idea of a supposedly pro-Israel lobby lobbying the US administration against the state of Israel, I find absolutely unacceptable. I find it morally reprehensible. If people want to try and influence Israel's policies who do not live in Israel, and I think if you do not live in Israel, you don't share in the burden, you don't share in the dangers. I think people have to do that very cautiously. And the way to do that is maybe within the Jewish community, which has admittedly limited effect on Israeli policy. I understand it's frustrating for people in the diaspora who care greatly and would like to shape things and feel a sense of partnership. Okay, to be a full partner, you have to buy all in. And if you're not going to be all in, then I think the way to express people's views is, again, is within the Jewish community, and you can support organizations in Israel that support the agenda that you believe in. But I think it's a fundamental error to do it in Washington. And to my regret, J Street has grown in support. I think there's a real need for increased Jewish education for young people. There's a need to get more and more people, young people and not young people, to visit to Israel. They may come back with some of the same fundamental views, let's say on the Palestinian resolution or whatever. Those views may not change, but coming to Israel, seeing things up close has a really transformational impact on how people view things. And I think there's also a need for a tempering of the rhetoric. That's true of everybody That's true of the US domestically, Israel domestically. It's true of the US-Israeli relationship. We're in a period of pretty ugly rhetoric. But I hear people within the American Jewish community, kind of leading figures in the last few years, come out saying, well, we don't support this kind of Israeli policy and we are alienated, we're disaffected, we're distancing ourselves. And I must say, what is it, 76 years, almost 77 years after the end of the Holocaust, and going on 73 years since Israel, 74 years since Israel was established, I find that kind of approach really reprehensible. Have an impolite suggestion for what people who say that might want to do. We only have one Jewish state, and it took us 2,000 years to reestablish it. After 74 years, for people to be saying things like that is really unacceptable. So as much as there may be a need for change in Israel's policies, I think there's a need for some considerable rethinking on the part of the American Jewish community, how it's handling things.
Thanks. Very interesting. So we have a follow-on question, I think, kind of a follow-on question about the role of social media in this, I guess, in this dialogue, if I read the question right. How does social media affect views on Israel?
It's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen data on that. My inclination would be to say not positively, probably even very negatively. But I haven't seen comparative data, so I don't want to take a definitive position on that. Social media tend to sharpen debate, rhetoric in most areas. So I would imagine it would be true of Israel as well. I see a lot of pretty horrifying stuff there. I see what is clearly a concerted effort to gain control, for example, over hashtags on Twitter. Because if you type in a hashtag and then the word Israel, some pretty horrible things are always attached to it. It's always Israel apartheid, Israel, Israeli crimes, Israeli horrible this, Israeli horrible that. But social media are also a good means for Israel to get its message out there. And the government tries, the IDF tries, various Jewish organizations in the US do. So at least to some extent, it plays in both directions.
Okay. No, thanks. We don't seem to have very many questions coming through, and I suspect that might be a challenge with the chat feature of this platform, possibly requiring a login or putting it in as a guest, which I did. I want to give it another few minutes to see if we don't get any more questions, and see what there is. Maybe to go back to one of my questions about the domestic situation. What impacts do you see in the demographic changes within the Jewish community, the American Jewish community, and how that affects our relations and position with Israel?
Okay, but before I do that, maybe you can explain to people how you were able to get in. Maybe that'll help them.
I basically just entered the chat role as a guest to type my name and then the question.
Okay, I'm not sure if that's gonna maybe a bit more detail explain to people how that works.
There's a chat window, and at the bottom of the window there's a ribbon, and basically there's a gray part to the right that says enter as guest.
Okay. Right, so they just open the chat window and then they can ask a question.
Yeah, but what I saw on my screen is the window's already there. You got the screen on the left and the window on the right. It says Larchmont Temple is real today. And then where it says sign into chat, you hit that, and then you'll see you should have the opportunity to sign in as a guest.
Okay. At least on my screen, there's no need for a sign in. You just press the chat.
I know. Okay, we have another breakthrough question. Have any of your feelings about the subject changed in any appreciable way in the past 1 to 2 years? interesting question.
Have my feelings changed in the last year or so about, in general, or the last, it's a general question, not specific?
This subject.
Which subject?
I guess the greater context of the American-Israeli relationship.
I don't know. I think things were heading in a bad direction a little over a half a year ago, before the elections in Israel. And I think that we've, at a bare minimum, gained some time there. I think that there's been an improvement. As I was saying before, there can still be significant disagreement on the Iranian issue in the not distant future. And it's also not incomprehensible to think that sooner or later the administration will want to achieve some progress on the Palestinian issue. So far, they've been too preoccupied with other issues. They were waiting for the new government in Israel to get the budget passed, which happened in November, which was a really critical turning point. One of the questions now is whether, well, partly because of domestic pressure, they'll want to bring up some of the Palestinian issues. To what extent they're still going to be very cautious because they don't want to prevent the rotation from happening in Israel in another year and 7-8 months. They're also, by the way, quite skeptical about the chances of achieving anything on the Israeli side or the Palestinian side. So I don't know that they will do a great deal, but they may do some, and that can cause difficulty. I think in the last year or two, I mean, I think those are the big, so the new government in Israel was a big change. Of course, there's the new administration in the US, but Mr. Biden is a very, very, very strong friend. I think the bigger question is the one that you were asking a minute ago, Larry, about the changes in American demography, specifically in the Jewish community. It goes beyond the Jewish community. I talked about that in the talk itself. But there aren't that many non-religious Jews left in the United States, certainly young ones, okay? The intermarriage rate is something like 70% on a national level. And we know that there is a very negatively significant correlation between intermarriage and ongoing identification with Jewish issues generally and Israel specifically. That's a painful reality. It's part of the price of living in an open liberal society.
Sure. All right, two more.
No, I'm very concerned about, so we have another 10, 20 years of that won't be bad because there's still the middle-aged Jewish community and the older Jewish community that still have the closer identification with Israel, but time will do what time does. And I'm concerned. I mean, I think we have something here that we would like to maintain, which is Jewish identity, the diaspora-Israel relationship. The Orthodox community is growing very, very rapidly, the ultra-Orthodox community. And by 2060, the statistics I read that are about a few years old, 4 or 5 years old, so nothing dramatic has changed. But by 2060, 25% of the American Jewish community is going to be ultra-Orthodox, which, by the way, is very similar to Israel, which is going to be about 30%. So you will have a much smaller, mostly extremely pro-Israel community, other than I call them the loonies, the Satmars and others who don't support Israel, but most of the ultra-Orthodox community does. But it's a different kind of support. It's a support from the right. It's a different set of social values. And most of an increasingly small American Jewish community will be less supportive.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's certainly something that, I think all of us, speaking for myself anyway, have perceived as I've as a grown up, the change in the makeup and constitution of the American Jewish population, locally and so on. So a couple more questions have come in. Do you see any change in Israeli policy with regard to building Jewish communities in the West Bank?
The current government was based on agreement not to agree when it comes to the West Bank issue. There aren't any major fundamental ideological differences on the other national security issues, the foreign and defense issues. Iran is pretty much a consensual issue, the same for Hezbollah and Hamas. There are differences over how exactly to handle it, but the objectives everybody shares. Even on many of the domestic issues, there's pretty broad agreement, and not all of them, but most of them. But the West Bank issues, the settlements, the Jewish communities, whatever term you wish to use, that's the wedge issue in Israel. Now, a majority of the public does not support unbridled settlement. Until a few years ago, there was a 2/3 majority that supported withdrawing from at least part of the West Bank. And then depending where you are on the spectrum, for some people it was a little bit, some people it was a lot, or all of the West Bank. That majority, by the way, has decreased in recent years as people have become increasingly skeptical of the chances of reaching an agreement. But in any event, that's the wedge issue in Israeli politics. And that's the one issue that this new government knowingly, explicitly said, we agree not to agree. In effect, we're going to try and maintain the status quo for the duration of the government. And that's true even a year and a half from now, when Mr. Lapid takes over. He just said in the last week, he said, don't expect any changes on that issue when I come in. That's not going to happen. The coalition is based on not making any big changes there. I hope what we'll see is some greater caution or more limited settlement policies for the next few years. Even Mr. Netanyahu, most of his tenure, didn't settle a great deal outside of the so-called settlement blocks, the areas that even the Palestinians agreed would be annexed to Israel as part of a final agreement, as part of land swaps. He did some, but most was there. To the extent that the new government continues doing that, then that doesn't pose a major problem, assuming that there will be land swaps. The big problem is the settlements and the settling outside of those areas. And yeah, if the one issue, which in the end is really an existential threat for Israel, in the non-physical sense of the word, but in terms of our fundamental character as a state, is exactly that. I was going to say, do we create a situation? We're already creating a situation in which separation is becoming increasingly hard and maybe almost impossible. Can we still reach a two-state solution down the line? It's no longer absolutely clear that we can. Every additional settler makes it that much harder to do it. So I don't expect a big change in this area for the next few years. And that's a long time, given the reality. It makes future separation that much harder.
Thanks. Go on to some more questions. Can you comment further on the potential impact of having Mansour Abbas, an Islamist, in the coalition government, and also his recent statement that Israel was born a Jewish state and will remain so? It's an interesting question.
Mansour Abbas, to my way of thinking, is a very interesting and in many ways welcome addition to Israeli politics, in the sense that he's just about the first Israeli Arab leader, certainly of the top leadership, to come out with the statement that the questioner was mentioning, when he said, yes, Israel was born as a Jewish state and it will remain that. Most of the leadership of the so-called joint list, until now the primary Arab party, They weren't willing to say that. Now, it's not as if most of them, let's say quietly in the back rooms, didn't acknowledge that, but to come out and say it publicly was hard. What Mansour Abbas, not to be confused with Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority,
Sure.
Abbas is a little bit like Cohen to Jews. It's a common name. What Mansour Abbas did is he said, look, I'm putting aside all these issues. We are citizens of Israel. We're going to remain citizens of Israel. We want to improve our lot as citizens of Israel. Now, he's also, by the way, been a little bit open in his, overly open to my taste, in his calls for just cynical politics, in the sense of, well, the Orthodox Party has always extorted unusual benefits for their constituencies. We're going to do exactly the same. So he didn't say it exactly in the way that I would have liked to have seen him say it, that I've heard him say it, but he's exactly right. What he said is, I'm going to deliver for my constituency. I'm going to play the political game like everybody else does it, as effectively as I can, and he's doing it very effectively. He's already gotten some really major budgeting, new programs for the Arab population. We're just at the beginning. The government's only 6 months in. So for the Israeli Arab public, I think he's an important change. It's an important change for Israel as a whole. Look, we have to, like it or not, I mean, whatever your political perspective is, we have to integrate the Arab population. That's a problem for people. I understand that that's a problem for people. If we do not integrate them, if we alienate them, then we turn them into adversaries. And what is today an ethnic problem, with religious and national overtones, we turn it into a real security problem. And actually, the number of Israeli Arabs who've ever been involved in bad things from a security perspective is small. Most of the Arab public very, very much wants to be integrated today into the broader Israeli society. And by the way, it's happening. It's happening in many remarkable ways. When you go to an emergency room, you're almost equally likely to be treated by an Arab doctor or nurse as by a Jewish one. And when you call up call centers in Israel today, the same thing holds true. Muhammad speaking. And when you go to movies and to restaurants and to the beach, all sorts of places where a decade ago you didn't see very many Israeli Arabs, partly because I think it was a cultural thing. It wasn't their thing, and it was partly maybe they didn't feel fully welcome. Well, today you see them in big numbers. So there are a lot of good things that are happening. There's also, by the way, some bad things happening. We saw it last May at the time of the round with Hamas, when there was some rather heinous violence between Jews and Arabs, and it went in both directions. Abbas, I would hope, is the beginning of the solution. It's a long-term problem, but an important step.
Thanks. So I have I think two questions. One was emailed to me, and the other is on the chat, and they both related. I think referring to the as we discussed demographics in the United States, and you started to mention it, the influence or the presence of the Israeli ultra-Orthodox community with its impacts on Israeli society militarily and culturally. I realize these are pretty broad questions, but I guess the big question is what are the trends or directions that you see happening with that?
We normally, when we talk about the demographic problem in Israel, we're referring to the demographic problem that would take place if Israel were to annex the West Bank. That's a big demographic problem. In some ways, I think an even bigger one is with the ultra-Orthodox, otherwise known as the Haredi population. And as I said, by 2060, they're going to be about 30% of Israel's Jewish population. Now, to my way of thinking, that is a threat on almost every level, in some ways even worse than the demographic problem with the Palestinians, because it's a national problem. Yes, religious overtones that make the conflict even harder to solve, but it's still mostly a national conflict with the West Bank, with the Palestinian Authority. I'm differentiating them from Hamas, which is a fundamentalist organization in Gaza. And there, the religious overtones to the conflict are explicit. Here, if we talk about the ultra-Orthodox population, and don't misunderstand me, I'm not talking about an enemy population and our own population. I'm not equating. But in some ways, the problem is even more difficult because it's an ultra-Orthodox, it's a fundamentalist population. They have God on their side, and not all, but a very large percentage of this public is not compromising and not in the mood to make a compromise with the secular public. There's also, I think, for reasons of internal Haredi politics, the political parties, the political leaders have probably been more hardline than many Haredim on the street. But it doesn't matter, because Haredi politics were extremist politics. And if in the past, Shas, for example, the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party, at times took a moderate, even semi-dovish position, it's been a couple of decades since that was the case. And both they and the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party are both firmly in the right-wing camp. And they've also, by the way, been firmly, totally loyal allies to Netanyahu. But in the long term, I think we have, I called it a threat, a major problem here, because it's a very right-wing population. Again, not everyone. And so they are going to support policies of settlement and annexation of the West Bank. And to my way of thinking, that's a threat to Israel's fundamental character as a predominantly Jewish and democratic state. They would differ, at least on the first part, on the Jewish side, because they say it'll be even more Jewish. It'll be halachic. That's not the kind of Jewish that I believe in. There is no way that Israel can continue to fund the preferential transfer payments that the Haredi parties, I would say, extorted from the governments over the last couple of decades. It's financial ruin. We're not there yet. Still, the secular public, primarily the high-tech sector, that's the engine of Israeli economic growth. And for the moment, we can still carry the burden, but not for long. It's another few years. What does it mean when a very large percentage of Israel's population, the Haredi population, are getting an education which would be considered poor and backward in third world countries? People who are graduating high school or yeshivas who lack basic understanding of mathematical and scientific concepts, have no English, have no skills for living in the modern world. And by the way, I'm somebody who was never very good in math, right? I'm not talking about advanced mathematics skills. I'm talking about being able to function in a modern society, get a job. They don't have those skills. The government has been promoting all sorts of remedial programs. Haven't worked too well because they're so far behind. You get somebody who's now in their 20s and they don't want to go back to basic schooling. There's a societal price to be paid here that isn't acceptable or isn't tenable. And just on a normative basis, what does all this mean for Israel's democracy when a significant portion of the public does not believe that the Knesset is the source of law, that the Israel, the state of Israel's book of laws is not the primary source of law, but it's the Torah, and it's the rabbis, it's not the judges. And they do not obey many laws, and they come out into the streets to protest a lot of laws. So I think that is a very severe problem. And as I was saying before, because they are a fundamentalist population with God on their side, reaching a compromise, reaching any understandings is very, very hard.
Thanks. So I have switching back to Iran. One of our questioners asks, what about the Chernobyl option, render Iran's nuclear facilities inoperable using tactical nuclear weapon on each facility, or maybe tactical weapon on each facility? I guess it's similar to the strike on the Iraqi facility in the early 80s, Osirak, if I have my name correct. But I know that's come up in past discussions on the Iran nuclear issue.
Right. So it's not Chernobyl. That was a nuclear accident. It's,
yeah,
if you want the precedence, it's exactly what you were saying. Osirak, the Iraqi reactor in 81, or the Syrian reactor in 2007. Those are the precedents for military strikes. No one, absolutely no one, is talking about using tactical nuclear weapons. Okay, that is tactical, strategic. Forget nuclear weapons. That is a non-starter. The world, the international community, I mean, I'm not a big fan of the term international community. I think it's not the most effective collection of states. Mm-hmm. But there's one of the good things that the international community did do in the post-war era. After the US used nuclear weapons twice, was to create an international taboo against the use of nuclear weapons. If there's just about anything that you can say that has become holy to the international community, it's the non-use of nukes, it's non-proliferation. President Kennedy famously came out with a statement in which he forecast that there would be tens of nuclear powers in not very long. I forget his precise time period. In reality, there are 8 declared nuclear states today, the original 5, then India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel is thought to be the 9th. But at most, we have 9 today, not dozens. And if anybody uses a nuke, the expression is use it and lose it. The international community will get after you, complete sanctions, severe sanctions. So that's not an issue. It's just not going to happen. Israel, assuming that it has the capability that the questioner is asking, it would be subject to such sanctions. Even the US wouldn't support it. Not going to happen. The question is whether there can be a conventional or a cyber attack that would, well, there's no option anymore for destroying the Iranian nuclear program. Too late for that. They've got the know-how. So even if you could destroy it completely, they can rebuild it in a short period of time. And the question is how much time various sabotage operations, whether kinetic or cyber, can gain. To date, none of them have gained more than a year or two. Well, if you take a few that have each gained a year or so, or in some cases less, in some cases months, the collective effort is we probably have gained a few years through sabotage. And I don't belittle one day. Every day that we gain is another day that we don't have a nuclear Iran. So I am all for continuing it. But it's a very partial solution. It buys a limited amount of time. That's all it does. It can supplement other activities.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, no, that's informative. I remember vividly as a 10th grader when the Osirak attack hit the news myself, and it's, you know, that's already over 40 years ago. I'm looking through the rest of the questions. So one of our questioners makes a statement. Thank you. I've always felt Israeli treatment of Arabs who stayed in Israel is a big part of Israelis or Israel's problem, and views in America. Interesting take on the, I guess it's the Israeli Arab population. If we say stayed in Israel, I assume that's what we're referring to. Any further thing to add on that?
I think we're just in a period where there are two almost contradictory trends at work today. One is that the reality of Israeli society is rapidly improving integration. Israeli Arabs really feeling more and more that they are part of broader Israeli society. There's also at the same time growing tension and antagonism within the Arab population. It's maybe partly because when you feel there's a process of maturation, when you feel that you really are a legitimate part of this bigger society, that you're not an outsider anymore, or shouldn't be, then people also present stronger and stronger demands. They feel more secure, more able, more empowered to make those demands. And so you see on the one hand, an improving reality, at the same time, maybe a deteriorating atmosphere, at least for some people. And I think Israeli Arab politics have gotten very heated. Now that's true of Israeli politics in general, but it precedes it. And a lot of the rhetoric is pretty heinous, I must say. Certainly very ugly. Here again, I think maybe Mansour Abbas can help improve things a little bit. He may be in trouble within his own party because a lot of people aren't willing to accept this outreach that he's doing. And the approach that says, well, let me put aside the Palestinian issues I'm worried just about, or I'm focusing primarily on our needs as a community within Israel. So yeah, this is certainly a problem, and not everyone, to put it mildly, on the Jewish side is supportive of improving things. And there are some people actively doing their best not to improve things. But I think the general direction is a positive one. By the way, it's not just now under the new government with Mansour Abbas. To his credit, Bibi, 6 years ago, I think, maybe it was 7 already, passed the biggest budget ever that was specifically directed at the Arab population. It was a huge program. Everybody on the semi-responsible left and right understands that Israel has to do more here.
Thanks. So I think will be the last question is my own question, and that's as a Reformed Jew, I went to Israel about 11 years ago, actually for one of my daughter's bat mitzvahs. We took the whole family. We had a great time. The one thing that I noticed when I was in Israel that I think was an eye-opener to me was the position and placement of the Reform Jewish community within Israel. We are a Reform temple, and historically, most large percentage of American Jews were Reform, but as we said before, that proportion of the population is declining, unfortunately. Intermarriage, assimilation to American population at large, and combined with the growth of the more Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox community, changing the complexion here. But the Reform Jews in Israel have always been, I hate to use the term second-class citizens. That's probably not accurate or entirely, honest, but definitely in the way that the practice of the Jewish faith is positioned within Israeli society, recognition of marriages and so on. I just found to be an interesting and alarming issue. The rabbi who did the bat mitzvah, Miri Gold, was one of the few Reform rabbis, maybe few Reform women rabbis practicing in Israel at the time, was herself in a tenuous position, only just getting funding for her salary from the Israeli state after that. So enough of my blather. Can you comment further on that issue and how it affects our relations with Israel.
First of all, the good news is that the reform movement is growing in strength in Israel. And the new government actually has already passed some significant reform legislation, not reform movement, but reformist legislation in this regard. For example, ending the monopoly that the rabbinate had on determining what kashrut is all about. And well, I'm drawing a blank for a second. There was another important change that they already put through. And, oh yeah, allowing local religious councils to appoint their own rabbis, not the rabbinate, or excuse me, giving them the right to giving them the right, the local rabbis, the right to do conversions or weddings or whatever. There was an important change there as well, and now they're talking about some other even bigger changes in the near future, such as in terms of conversion. There won't be a monopoly of the rabbinate anymore. You have to understand that because Israel doesn't have a separation of church and state, or synagogue and state, for better and for worse, and so religious issues are political issues. And the ultra-Orthodox parties and the religious parties as a whole always had a monopoly over the rabbinate. This was simple politics. Because there wasn't a base here of significance for the reform or conservative movements, it was the religious establishment, the ultra-Orthodox establishment, just managed to set the national agenda in this area. It's pure politics, that's all it was. Now, if you're a reform or conservative Jew abroad and you come to Israel and you see that the reform and conservative movements are treated differently, and yes, you're right, as second-class citizens, I'm not afraid to say it. My son, by the way, had his bar mitzvah in a reform shul in Ramat Shalom. Yeah, then so you're horrified when you see that. How can the Jewish state discriminate against fellow Jews? Again, pure politics. Now, here's one of those cases where, as unacceptable, and I even say in many ways, reprehensible as this is to me, we all have to learn to compromise a bit between our normative values and reality. Look, this you can say is an immoral outrage, but the number of American Jews whose lives are in any way, substantive way affected by this is almost non-existent. Israel lives with endless moral quandaries. We're compromising on things all the time. By the way, I think people in the US increasingly are also. But Israel's doing it all the time in the face of existential threats and major domestic challenges. Okay, this is a price that the diaspora has to live with as well. I'm not saying to drop it. I'm not saying not to be angry over it, but put it in proportion. Like I said before in another context, we only have one Jewish state. There's a price for having it. Okay, give it some time. Hopefully we'll address everything in time.
Sure. No, I agree. It wasn't so much anger, but it was a revelation. I think seeing it firsthand. All right. On that note, I think we've gone through the questions, and we've been at this for an hour and a half all told, including the talk. I thank you for your time, Professor Freilich, with us. I think you've given the audience a lot to think about. I thank my fellow Temple Brotherhood folks for hanging on, and for those of you who got your questions through, I thank you. If anyone didn't, we'll try to overcome any technical obstacles next time. I hope the discussion was interesting. So with that, I think we're going to conclude. I wish everyone a great, safe, happy, healthy day, and get through the rest of the winter ahead. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.
Okay.